welcome back. This is part 2 of the lecture on ethical issues in rural areas. I said in the last slide we were starting on, or in the last lecture we're starting on slide 8. We're actually starting on slide 6. And in this slide we're discussing specifically job placement. And job placement, which has its own section of the class devoted solely to the issues surrounding that. But job placement has some specific ethical issues. First of all, it has a new name, or it's emerging. It's called the dual customer approach, or demand side approach to job placement, where the counselor develops relationships with employers, focusing on solving their problems, helping them find qualified staff, helping them find trained staff, helping them screen individuals, helping them meet those disability and various issues, accessibility issues that companies often have, and becoming a human resource for these companies. And in rural areas, you have a limited number of employers, and many times other service providers are trying to get in to meet these the persons responsible for the hiring at these employers. So these relationships are very difficult to cultivate. And as we discussed earlier, because there are limited employers, many consumers could be impacted by the actions of a single one. For example, the first person that an employer agrees to hire that's working with VR, if they come in and do a particularly poor job, it's possible that person may be very close-minded to anybody that VR counselor would recommend again. So potentially a lot of individuals have been impacted because of that individual's poor performance. Or if something goes wrong on the job site, accommodations aren't being made, or there's just some issues related, maybe not disclosing disability because you're afraid of what the employer, how they may view that person, and it may cause them to lose a job, not so that because it impacts that person, but all the other individuals that may be referred from your agency. It's probably done, if it is done, and I think there are times it probably occurs, it's done trying to benefit a larger group, because if in a rural area, if a school system is maybe the biggest employer, and if you don't develop that relationship, you lose that relationship. A lot of people may have lost some advantages, or lost, there may be benefits lost, or availability lost to people that counselor or that agency is working with. No matter what, though, the counselor has to advocate for that consumer. If there are problems with the employer, the counselor has to deal with those issues as they arise for each and every consumer, whether or not it may impact farther down the line. However, knowing that, the counselor needs to go ahead and plan and develop some skills, or in their mind, kind of plan out, how am I going to address this issue should there be a problem, still maintain a relationship and advocate for my consumer. It's this kind of approach that also feeds into that next bullet, where we're talking about fairness when informing consumers of available jobs. Sometimes counselors or people doing placement, they work so hard to develop these relationships. They want the perfect person to take that first, to get that first job, to open that business up to more consumers, more persons with disabilities. And a lot of times they may have on their caseload several people that would qualify, that are interested, but one may not have a very good attitude, whatever that may be, but their motivation may be suspect. that may have had some other job-related issues, but they are at that point where it's time for them to get a job. And counselors and job placement staff may be tempted, instead of risking that employment site, by having a consumer that may do subpar work get the job, they may just neglect to tell that consumer about that job and only tell the consumer that they think will do the best job based on their judgment, so that other consumers will have will have options. Tough ethical issue. Again, code provides pretty clear guidance on how to handle that. We have to be fair to everybody and make sure we inform anybody that could potentially benefit from that job, of that opening. Outcomes, always a big issue. Rural counselors have always been impacted by outcomes. There is, at this point, if you're talking in the public VR program, no credit is given to placement, in rural areas versus metro areas. Goals are set by the state on a state basis, but many times, counselors in rural areas have the same outcome goals as those in metro areas, and these requirements can often, there's always issues when you're dealing with holding staff accountable for outcomes. You have to make sure that outcome is in the best interest of the consumer. And many times, the jobs that are available are readily available in a rural labor market are undesirable jobs, and counselors and job placement staff may be tempted to push consumers into those jobs because of outcomes, whether or not that they're able to work in professional work, if they're trained, if they have a degree, or if they have various other skills that with a little bit more hard work and a little time, the labor market may eventually bear out to where they could get some employment better suiting and better meeting those skill levels. The counselor, though, with that outcome requirement, may be tempted because they just don't have the resources and necessarily the time, may be tempted to push people in jobs which may not be in their best interest. An emerging tool for counselors and consumers in communicating, and what has been put forth as a way to solve some of the barriers to providing VR services in rural areas, has been technology and distance counseling. One of the issues the counselor has to deal with, even in rural areas, is dealing with some of the social media, electronic mail or email, the ways that consumers try to communicate with counselors or other providers. It's important for the consumer to understand and be informed by the counselor the boundaries of any electronic communication, especially email, because it is so common. It's important to understand when it's appropriate, what is appropriate to go in that information. People don't think twice about sending a joke or a political cartoon, and it's important that the counselor, first of all, not send that, but also tell the consumer, you have my email, but it is only for professional interactions. Also, the limitations of email. When I send you something, you can't see my face. You can't see that I'm laughing. We all use emoticons, but those too aren't necessarily appropriate, and there's confusion or potential for confusion. So it's important to express the limitations. One other thing, if you're going to keep those emails for a record, it's very important that you tell the consumer that those will be kept in a file as record of the communication, so the person is well aware of that what they're saying is being kept in a case file somewhere. Another emerging technology that people, I think, are still trying to figure out what to do with in terms of service provision are things like video phones, discussion boards, instant messaging, chat rooms. I think that you probably could span the country and see a lot of these used in counseling settings and therapeutic settings. In this region, probably most of our counselors utilize maybe email and video phone. They don't necessarily use those other modes. However, it's important that if they do, that they discuss the limitations, again, those same things as with emails, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and what those modes would be used for. Most of the time, I would recommend, I know a lot of folks that utilize ASL who are deaf or hard of hearing and utilize ASL like the video phones. A lot of people use email, and that's generally what we recommend. As far as our agency, where I'm employed with the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, we don't recommend instant messaging, chat rooms, texting. We don't recommend giving a consumer your cell phone number. So it's very important, though, if that's how you do operate, to make sure that you discuss the limitations and the potential for loss of confidentiality, the lack of control of anything sent via the web. One other issue related to technology, especially for rural counselors, is they work in such spread out areas. A counselor may work in 5 or 6 counties and potentially be in a different office every day. And if they don't have a laptop or something that can connect to their to a network, then they're forced to utilize a different computer every day, and so they carry their information with them, and they can't carry their paper files, so they end up putting their files on jump drives or thumb drives or whatever you want to call them, which often those are easily lost, those are easily left behind. You have to make sure that confidential information is not lost or misplaced. And I also have listed on here just some of the paperless efforts that we're seeing out there. Again, those are tough for rural counselors because a lot of times they have to be someplace where they can get internet access, high speed. There's always the potential for confidentiality issues, and just the loss of some important documentation, because a lot of times when they say it's paperless, what happens is once it's scanned, no more copies are made, and eventually that original is destroyed. Once it's destroyed, it may be gone forever should something happen to the record system. So always an issue. So that's basically it in regards to the issues that are out there. There are many more, but these, in my opinion, are the pressing issues facing the rural areas. I do want to talk just a minute on how the new code sort of impacted counselor, the life of a counselor a little bit. I do feel that it provided much better guidance in terms of non-professional relationships, especially for rural counselors, because if you worked, this example, if you worked in a rural area and you helped a consumer start a business, self-employment, because that's often an option, then it was very unclear as to whether or not it was appropriate for you to then patronize that business as a customer. However, in the new code, it clearly states that if it be of benefit, if that non-professional contact can be a benefit to the consumer, then it is permissible. Also, use of technology. Now, when the previous code was developed, it's important to understand that it wasn't in wide use. The electronic email, internet was not in wide use as it is today. None of these social medias like Twitter and Facebook and Flickr and discussion boards, those were at best in their infantile state. So, it was kind of unheard of that we would be doing counseling in that manner, or that we would communicating near as much as we are. It was just it's unbelievable thinking back at that time how naive we were about what we would be doing with the available technology. So the code really laid out the use of technology, the counselor's responsibility, the information, the consent that has to be expressed to the consumer, and that, to me, that was that's exactly what was needed. It clarified exceptions to releasing confidentiality, clarified maintaining a confidential work environment. We're starting to move into a time period where people are less offices, less private places and buildings, and this is especially true in rural areas where there is generally limited space. So the CRC gives that counselor justification to fight for private areas, to hold conversations and make phone calls with and on behalf of consumers. One issue I feel that there's been a heavy burden placed on the consumer or the counselor as far as providing information up front, disclosure. If you read through, and again, I would encourage you at least once or twice a year, read through the Code of Ethics. There's a lot of public disclosure or prior disclosure that's on the counselors, that they specifically state that the counselor has a responsibility to perform. So it's important that you know your responsibility and how you should be disclosing to your consumers. Okay. Now, how do we address these issues from an administrative point or from a counselor point? I have 3 suggestions. The first is a mentor program. One of the very difficult things about being a counselor in a rural area is you're often on an island. You may have 5 counties, 6 counties you have to cover, 10 counties. You may be in and out of the office. The person, if you happen to share an office with somebody, they may cover the same area, they may be in the same issue. It used to be there was no mechanism, no methodology for addressing the training needs and sort of the support needs for those counselors. And recently, there have been some more emphasis on establishing, and it's not necessarily a supervisory relationship, but a mentoring relationship, but establishing relationships between other counselors similarly situated as these rural counselors, to provide feedback and guidance and be there as a resource, and to talk about situations which we've discussed in this lecture. What kind of ethical issues are there, and give them a little, there's more experience to draw from when something occurs. And not only can they help them anticipate, but when something occurs that the counselor isn't sure, they know exactly who to call and get guidance or feedback or bounce ideas off. And it's important as an agency to, if you're from an administrative viewpoint, to foster that communication, to establish programs so that your new counselors have other counselors out there more seasoned that can help them, so they're not out there on an island, so they're not alone. Because what happens when people that work in isolation and make isolated decisions, they're more likely to make a mistake. When you involve more individuals, it's more likely that better decisions are going to be made. So a mentorship program is a great opportunity to help out your newer employees. It's very important from an administration level that you understand the ethical issues related to working in a rural area, that you provide resources, you provide training, that you listen to the supervisors of that area about these specific issues, and provide, again, those resources that counselors need, be it a hotline or be it whatever that your team or that the administration can come up with to give counselors resources, so when problems occur or ethical issues arise, that they know where to go and they get support in dealing with those issues. Also, administration needs to be savvy to, because many administrators may or may not be CRCs and may or may not have to follow the CRC Code of Ethics. So it's important, even if an administrator does not have to follow it, they're aware of it and fight for the standards set forth in the CRC Code, especially related to confidentiality, work environment, use of technology and distance technology. And this sort of feeds into that last point, which is policy development. The agency and the administration has to make sure policy is developed that is in line with the CRC Code of Ethics. Doesn't ask counselors to make choices between following an agency procedure and their ethical code and their profession, and also supports counselors in their efforts to provide ethical services that backs up the CRC code. So those are three strategies that are out there that have to be, that need to be in place to assist counselors and other VR or rehab providers out there trying to provide quality services. And with that, that's the end of this week's lecture. Please be sure to review all the related materials and be sure to participate in your discussion boards.